Hello, it's Sunny Sharma with India Insight with Sunny Sharma. I'm back with my part two of two discussion on We Shall Overcome the Second Reconstruction, 1954 to 1975. So just before I start, I really, just for my audience and friends, if you enjoy these video podcasts, which I'll upload the audio later in a month, in about 15 days, please follow, share, and subscribe for future episodes. My podcast is called India Inside with Sunny Sharma, and my YouTube channel is Sunny Sharma at India Inside Movement. These 9 episodes, plus a summary of the lessons learned from this examination, covers 5 eras of American history since the founding of the Republic in 1776 and is in honor of Black History Month in February. Now to get started. Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little, grew up in Michigan under adverse conditions after his father, a follower of Marcus Garvey, was killed by racists. Subsequently, he worked as a small-time hustler and drug dealer in Boston and Harlem until he was arrested for robbery in 1946. In 1948, he converted to the Nation of Islam in prison, and after his release, slowly amassed a reputation as an impeccable orator, credited with building the Nation of Islam to an immense membership. The leaders of the nation slowly became suspicious of Malcolm X's influence, and after Malcolm X spoke controversial remarks concerning the aftermath of the death of John F. Kennedy, who was widely liked by the American Republic, he was silenced. In 1964, Malcolm established his own mosque, followed by the creation of the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which really was a combination of blacks in America and the diaspora of blacks in America and places like England, along with a unity with blacks in Africa. Throughout his travels in his last year of life, he not only visited Mecca and many parts of Africa, but he also began to embrace a revolutionary black nationalist, internationalist perspective. Malcolm's perspective for economic liberation and indictment of colonialism made him a target of the FBI. The authors note that on February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated in the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem. In his very famous Ballot or the Bullet speech, delivered on 2 occasions in 1964, 1 year before his death, Malcolm X reveals some fundamental insights of the importance of Black nationalism to reclaiming ownership of the Black community and the dangerous hypocrisy and vices of the establishment, who Malcolm believed would merely be seeking Black people's vote, but not their interests in the election year of 1964, whereby the political philosophy of Black nationalism means that the Black man should control the politics and politicians in his own community, no more. To Malcolm, this remedy would be the realization of political democracy for Blacks. However, he also discusses the need to focus on the social fabric of the Black community as well. Through the social philosophy of Black nationalism only means that we have to get together and remove the evils, the vices, alcoholism, drug addiction, and other evils that are destroying the moral fiber of our community. Malcolm X also insists that nonviolent action, which appeals to the conscience of its adversary, is not realistic because, as history has demonstrated, Uncle Sam has no conscience. Malcolm insists that Blacks should join any organization preaching the true values of Black nationalism, and this was his perspective much later on, but also to leave any organizations that stray from this ideology. The summer of 1966 saw the emergence of the philosophy of Black power, as best evidenced through such figures as Stokely Carmichael, born in Trinidad. In 1966, Carmichael replaced John Lewis as the head of SNCC and began to argue that integration was not a solution to the Black problem. He details his ideas in the 1967 book, The Politics of Liberation in America, which he co-authored with Charles Hamilton. Influenced by Pan-Africanist thought as advocated by such men as Kwame Nkrumah, Carmichael changed his name to Kwame Ture and created the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. Another tremendously important figure who was the main organizer within the Black Freedom Movement was Bayard Rustin, born in Westchester, Pennsylvania. He was a member of the Young Communist League in the mid-1930s, was a conscientious objector during World War II, helped establish SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, worked as a special assistant to Dr. King for 7 years, and most importantly, was the primary architect behind the 1963 March on Washington. Rustin, like many of the older, more moderate Black leaders, was concerned about the Black Power movement, growing more conservative as he grew older. Like Rustin, Carmichael highlights in his speech, What We Want, that the work of SNCC from 1961 to 1965 was critical in getting the vote. Without franchise, organizing political power for the Black community was impossible. In his speech, Black Power and Coalition Politics, Bayard Rustin speaks to the divisive danger of the Black Power movement approach as it diverts from the movement from a meaningful debate over strategy and tactics, and it isolates the Negro community, and it encourages the growth of anti-Negro forces. Moreover, Rustin believed the Black Panther Party's Black Power perspective was not just reactionary and utopian, it took blacks away from the political struggle for rights, as Southern Negroes, despite exhortations from SNCC to organize themselves into a Black Panther Party, are going to stay in the Democratic Party. To them, it is the party of progress, the New Deal, the new frontier, and the Great Society, and as Bayard Rustin said, they are right to stay. Rustin also speaks to the massive unemployment rate among blacks, as well as the lack of adequate housing, whereby so too with housing, which is deteriorating in the North, and yet the housing provisions of the 1966 Civil Rights Bill are weaker than the anti-discrimination laws in several states, which contain the worst ghettos, even with these laws on their books. Lastly, Rustin speaks to the importance of learning the lessons of the several organized victories in Alabama, stating that, nevertheless, pride, confidence, and a new identity cannot be won by glorifying blackness or attracting whites. They can only come from meaningful action, from good jobs, and from real victories, such as were achieved on the streets of Montgomery, Birmingham, and Selma. Floyd McKissick, born in Asheville, North Carolina, became active in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, and eventually replaced James Farmer as the head of the organization in 1966, whereby the organization started to identify with the Black Power movement. The authors note that through the Nixon administration, McKissick successfully secured a $14 million bond issue guarantee for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, but in doing so, he had to endorse Nixon for re-election in 1972. In a brief proclamation called Why the Negro Must Rebel, McKissick indicts the economic system while adhering to constitutional principles whereby, although slavery as a recognized legal institution has been abolished, economic slavery, economic exploitation has not. Furthermore, he speaks of the needs of blacks to seize their own agency in solving their problems because we cannot look elsewhere for help. We cannot lean on the crutch of religion. We cannot depend on phony coalitions. We must work out our own methods. We must draw our own conclusions. Lastly, he proclaims the right of revolution is a constitutional right condoned by the creation of the American Constitution itself. When we assert the right of revolution, we are asserting a constitutional right, alluding to the American Revolution. Dr. King shifted significantly to the left towards the end of his life, advocating democratic socialism. He ardently supported a reorganization of society in line with something he called a revolution of values. In the remarks he delivered at New York City's Riverside Church, we see a much more radical King, which is not represented in history due to a focus on his perspectives before 1966. Dr. King begins the speech with an appeal to conscience, highlighting that some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found that the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony, but we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak. Just as an aside, Cornel West compiled a collection of Dr. King's more radical speeches in a book called Radical King, providing a perspective of a more radical Martin Luther King than was his previous perspective before 1966. Now to continue. This radicalism was emblematic of 1966, which also saw the creation of the Black Panther Party for self-defense, founded by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. Newton not only spearheaded the revolutionary organization that patrolled the streets to protect blacks from police brutality, but he also gave back to the community through free breakfast programs for kids and public health services. Many Panthers were rightly or wrongly indicted in court, including Newton, and eventually, due to FBI counterintelligence program, the Black Panthers began to decline. Their legacy and 10-point programs have inspired generations of Black activists. Alluding to America's founding political documents, he states in point 9 of the 10-point program that we believe that the courts should follow the U.S. Constitution so that Black people will receive fair trials. Newton makes several recommendations on the defection of Eldridge Cleaver from the Black Panther Party and the defection of the Black Panther Party from the Black community. First and foremost, Newton declares that any action which does not mobilize the community towards the goal is not a revolutionary action. The action might be a marvelous statement of courage, but if it does not mobilize the people towards a goal of higher manifestation of freedom, it is not making a political statement and could be counter-revolutionary. We realize at a very early point in our development that a revolution is a process. It is not a particular action, nor is it a conclusion. It is a process. To Newton, revolution can only be achieved by a change in the systemic conditions of a group of people. He also speaks to the importance of leadership when organizing the people to see the bigger picture behind revolutionary movements as so we lead the people by following their interests with a view towards raising their consciousness to see beyond particular goals. Such leadership was best expressed by the head of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton. Although Hampton was an outstanding organizer, charismatic speaker, and proponent of Marxist theories, he was murdered by Chicago police in 1969 who were uncomfortable with his growing influence. Hampton relates that capitalism or class issues preceded the race problem, and that this recognition is crucial to get the oppressed involved in a revolution to counter the oppressors. Those that don't admit to that are those that don't want to get involved in a revolution, because they know as long as they're dealing with a race thing, they'll never be involved in a revolution, unquote. There were also women who were proponents of Black revolutionary thought, such as the intellectual Angela Davis. Angela Davis, born in Birmingham, Alabama, was a Black intellectual concerned with gender issues through an analysis of Black feminist thought, was critical of racial divides, was a proponent of socialism, and was strongly against the prison industrial complex. She was fired from teaching at the University of California in Los Angeles for affiliation with the Communist Party and was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list after guns she purchased were used by Black Panther members. The authors described the push for her freedom as the Communist Party and the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression organized a mass struggle to win her freedom, and the jury acquitted her of her charges. The 1981 book, Women, Race, and Class, was critical in the development of modern ideas concerning Black feminist thought. Additionally, she helped found an organization dedicated to democracy and socialism called the Committee of Correspondence, while also writing many important books such as Are Prisons Obsolete and Abolition Democracy Beyond Empire, Prisons, and Torture. She inspired many prominent intellectuals, including Dr. Michelle Alexander, who provides a modern-day critique of the mass incarceration system known as the New Jim Crow in her 2010 book. Through her books and essays, Davis illustrates why Black women are the most oppressed segment of society. The League of Revolutionary Black Workers was a network consisting of independent Black militant working organizations, including Detroit's Drum Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, Ford Revolutionary Union Movement, and the United Black Brothers of Maha, New Jersey. Even though it was gone by the mid-1970s, the League left a legacy of political consciousness based on a merger of Marxist theory with Black militancy of factory workers. Their platform is based on organizations of Blacks, education, forming a united coalition with other groups, and advocating self-defense in the Black community like the Black Panthers. However, political platforms were not just restricted to organized labor. There is also the platform of the Attica prisoners, comprised of primarily Black and Latino inmates, outlined in the 1971 The Fury of Those Who Are Oppressed. The demands were characterized by a stern desire to overturn the racist and oppressive conditions of the incarceration system that came to represent not just the prisoners of Attica, but also were an indictment of the entire prison system in America. Some of their demands included healthier food, education for rehabilitation and higher degrees, end of censorship, open communication, and most importantly, an end to segregation in the prison system. Nonetheless, there were other movements by politicians to unite the Black community and provide a clear agenda that communicated their aspirations and grievances. The National Black Political Convention in Gary, Indiana, which took place on March 1972 to increase Black political power in a number of arenas, demanding a government response to pressing need for childcare, a guaranteed minimum wage, increased funds for community development, the creation of a new public service jobs, and the end of the death penalty. This was the peak of the Black Power movement, attracting 3,000 delegates and more than 4,000 observers from localities across America where Black representatives began to flourish. The authors described that the principal organizers of the convention were Gary Mayor Richard Hatcher, Detroit Congressman Charles Diggs, and the cultural nationalist and Black arts movement founder Amiri Baraka. The Gary Declaration, Black Politics at the Crossroads, highlights that the crisis in America is the natural product of a society built on the twin foundations of white racism and white capitalism. One speech at the convention highlights that even if party politics have been characterized by changes in names and positions fundamentally, both parties have betrayed us whenever their interests conflicted with ours, which was most of the time, and whenever our forces were unorganized and dependent, quiescent, and compliant. Like Dr. King's pronouncement that society is relegated to either coexistence or co-annihilation, the convention declared blacks face either social transformation or social destruction. Those are our only real choices. The convention leaders insist that history shows white politics cannot create a new society. Blacks must seize the agency to create independent black politics for the changes they seek. They summarize the need for a person-centered politics whereby, at Gary, we are faithful to the best hopes of our fathers and our people if we move for nothing less than a politics which places community before individualism, love before sexual exploitation, a living environment before profits, peace before war, justice before unjust order, and morality before expediency. In his 1972 essay, There is No Revolution Without the People, Amiri Baraka, born in Newark, New Jersey, speaks to the need to not just organize, but also recognize political parties as the foundation for political consciousness for the masses. Baraka was not just the founder of the Congress of African People in 1970 and was one of the key organizers of the Gary Black Political Convention. He also is one of the most well-known and influential American artists and writers of the 20th century. As a playwright, poet, and music critic, he became the central leader of the Black arts movement in the 1960s and 1970s, as well as a powerful voice for the politics of Black cultural nationalism. Even today, he continues to provide constructive political, literary, and artistic critiques of powerful institutions. In the Pan-African Party and the Black Nation, Baraka argues not only are community organizations the foundation for political organization, but also that the political party must build alternative system values and institutions that will move and raise us. How we build such alternative forms is what the Congress of African People is about. However, communist ideologies were still alive in this period, even after the era of McCarthyism. Henry Winston, who grew up in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and Kansas City, Missouri, was essential to the Communist Party of the U.S. and critical of imperialism. At 19, due to economic reasons, he began working for the Kansas City's Unemployed Council, later joined the Young Communist League and the Communist Party USA, and in both organizations achieved Marx status. The authors note his military involvement and influence in which, during World War II, Winston helped enlist thousands of communists into the armed forces while fighting in Europe himself, receiving an honorable discharge. Unfortunately, in 1947, like many communists during the era of McCarthyism, he was given a 5-year jail sentence under the Smith Act, which prohibited the advocacy of Marxism. His subsequent impact as Communist Party leader, chairman in 1966 and onward is undeniable. The authors describe how in this role he helped defend Angela Davis, opposed the Vietnam War, and wrote 2 books, Strategy for a Black Agenda and Class, Race, and Black Liberation. In a somewhat bygone era when communist affiliation was deeply scrutinized, people such as Winston provided an essential critique of not just capitalism, but also how this and other economic systems were linked to racial exploitation. Like many before him, he insists that the struggle people face against fascism, colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism for the full realization of freedom across the globe is best illustrated whereby the kind of equality the Black people demand in the United States must embody and practice the actual exercise of that right, which is characterized by opportunities fully realized, free from discrimination on the job, in housing, education, health, culture, and unrestricted in the struggles in any area of democratic and social advancement. Even if one may disagree with his Marxist interpretation of the class struggle and its application to racial animosity, Winston was one of the first African Americans to provide a critical and clear indictment of not just capitalist exploitation in America, but the problem of imperialism around the world, especially in South Africa. In conclusion, to summarize this section, the period of Section 4, We Shall Overcome the Second Reconstruction, 1954 to 1975, though being only 2 decades, was a period marked by courageous defiance to the Jim Crow system of the South, resistance to segregation in the North and South, the achievement of legislative protections for Black franchise, a rise in Black power politics, indictments of imperialism and fascism throughout the globe, a continuation of Marxist interpretation of race, and by the 1970s, an explosion in the election of Black public officials, many of whom were previous freedom fighters, to political positions across America. We see the rise in not just impeccable orators like Malcolm X, many who shifted to more international perspectives during 2 decades of American prosperity in an era of immense change, but also the rise in women involvement in defiance of not just class and racial exploitation, but also a male-dominated world. Nonviolent strategists such as Bayard Rustin and James Lawson viewed Black nationalism as divisive and distracting from the achievement of the launching of successful political campaigns for Blacks after the achievement of legal protections for the vote. Those proponents of Black power and Black nationalism, on the other hand, began to attract many of the same young people in the mid 1960s and onwards who had relied on the integrationist approach of nonviolent civil disobedience before, which they had felt had failed them. However, if we are honest with ourselves, though the Black Power approach did provide an essential critique of the class underpinnings to racism, it was in fact the leaders of the civil rights movement, including Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, Dr. King, John Lewis, Ralph Abernathy, Bayard Rustin, Reverend James Lawson, and others, who are credited with the passing of the 1964 Civil Rights Legislation and 1965 Voting Rights Act. In the words of James Lawson, these were the furthest reaching legislation passed on behalf of we the people in the history of the American Republic. Is this completely genuine? Perhaps not. Black consciousness and Black power were not just a critique of capitalist race exploitation, it was also a cultural phenomenon which perhaps in the long run redefined how Black people saw themselves, maybe in greater degree than the civil rights movement sought to. At the end of the day, it was not just Christian love that contributed to a unified effort to overturn an evil system, but also Black consciousness aided by the influence of Marxist ideologues and Black nationalists going back to the period of abolitionism. Nonetheless, I must agree with Dr. Marable and Dr. Manning that Black power was not able to establish itself as a comprehensive system because it was fundamentally based on a limited perspective of human potential, unlike the realization of the active nonviolent civil disobedience, the beloved community. Still, near the end of his life, Dr. King realized this could only be achieved by radical reorganization in society that such figures as Malcolm X and others were describing, an end to capitalist exploitation, an elimination of political opportunism towards the Black community, and the fulfillment of a revolution of values against the evils of racism, militarism, and poverty. What I didn't realize is that this revolution of values was Dr. King's way of getting closer to Malcolm X. After 1966, 1 year past Malcolm X's death. This was not Dr. King's initial approach. On the other hand, Malcolm X realized the power of Dr. King's movement, not only shifting towards an internationalist perspective of Black nationalism, but also recognizing that Black power, though correct in its feeling and expression, was unfortunately too divisive as a realistic approach. If you enjoyed this video podcast, please follow, share, and subscribe for future episodes. My podcast is called India Insight with Sunny Sharma, and my YouTube channel is Sunny Sharma at India Insight Movement. These 9 episodes, plus a summary of the lessons learned from this examination, covers 5 eras of American history since the founding of the Republic in 1776 in honor of Black History Month, February. In the description below are the titles for the 5 sections reflecting the 5 periods of American history since 1768 up till 2008 with the seminal election of Barack Obama to the presidency. These sections are based off the book Let Nobody Turn Us Around, an African American anthology. So as you see from these, if you look at these sections here, the upcoming podcast, my last podcast to do, last 3 podcasts are 2 parts on the future and the present and contemporary African American thought, 1975 to the present. And in that, it will be divided into 2 parts, followed by my summary, which will be my last section, section 10, just summarizing all of these, the full history of Black intellectual thought since the founding of the American Republic in 1776. And now just to summarize this second part of We Shall Overcome, these 2 decades of change from 1954 to 1975. I'll say a lot of the similar things I said on the last podcast. I mean, this period was characterized by the nonviolent civil disobedience struggle led by Bayard Rustin, James Lawson, and Dr. King. It was characterized by the 1970s, a rise in Black power politics. There was a united effort by Black politicians to analyze the oppression of Blacks structurally and systemically in America and to offer a solution, which is an independent Black politic. I think in many ways there was a failure to this movement. It did not succeed fully. Even though there was a rise in a Black bourgeoisie, but this Black bourgeoisie in many cases was, as you'll see in the next podcast, where there was an immense rise in the Black bourgeoisie after 1975, they were very much disconnected from the average conditions of the poor and the working class African Americans. And that's one of the reasons why there was still a sentiment for segregation, while there was a leaning of many young people towards Black power and Black culturalism. And much of this was influenced by figures such as Stokely, Carmichael, and Malcolm X. And There has also been a decrease in the sentiment of Marxist ideology. I think many people were influenced by Marxism, such as the advocacy by Fred Hampton, who understood that race exploitation was underpinned by class exploitation. And I think many people, including Angela Davis, as well as Fred Hampton and the Black Panthers, understood the principles of Marxism and how they were important. But ultimately, it was Christian love through the civil disobedience movement that had the last word. Because the achievements of civil rights and the Voting Rights Act were achieved mainly through the civil disobedience movement. But still, this does not deny the fact that Black power and Black nationalism helped shape creative and cultural arts for many Black people across America. But was this a comprehensive system? Probably not. But nonetheless, it was very influential culturally. So here's a preview. I'll briefly go over a preview of the next podcast. The part one and part two, the future and the present, contemporary African American thought, 1975 to the present. There was a very significant rise in Black feminist theory, which was influenced by past Black feminist leaders. The Combahee River Collective, formed by Black feminists in Boston in 1974, lasted until 1980. There was a rise in movement to free political Black leaders, especially Black Panther leaders who were marginalized in the prison system, such as Assata Shakur, who was a target of the FBI's counterintelligence program. There was a rise in Rainbow Coalition leaders, such as Harold Washington, the first Black mayor of Chicago. There were many important Black feminist leaders and writers, such as Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks, which I'll go over later in the next podcast. There was Randall Robinson, who is a significant legal figure in American history. Dr. Bell Hooks was also one of the most important feminist thinkers who really dedicated her life even today to dismantling hierarchical structures in race, sex, and class. Jesse Jackson, a picture of him here on the left, is born in South Carolina, was head of the chapter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and ran for president in the mid 1980s. And Jesse Jackson and Harold Washington really showed that a rainbow coalition led by future leaders such as Obama could win an election as a Black minority leader. There's Dr. Molefi Kete-Asante, who coined Afrocentricity. Dr. Cornel West, perhaps the most important intellectual of the modern era, who really was, in many ways, a part of the legacy of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. Dr. Cornel West talks about the ethical implications of Marxism, and also about why why nihilism is more so a threat to the Black community than is oppression or exploitation. Henry Louis Gates was also a very significant figure who's also a part of the legacy of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. He completed Du Bois' unfinished Encyclopedia Africana. There's also a communist leader who ran for the communist ticket. Jarvis Tyner ran twice in 1972 and 1976. Louis Farrakhan, who became the leader of the Nation of Islam. He's a very controversial leader, and he organized one of the biggest Black organized campaigns in history. There's also a legacy of the Attica prison revolt, the Sing Sing prison, where many masters of professional studies graduates made an infamous criticism of prison conditions, still relevant today, as seen through the new Jim Crow system. The Black Radical Congress, composed of 35 veteran political activists, sought to discuss the place of the American left and provide a newfound political vision to reform Black politics in the nation. There's also the rise in hip-hop activism in the 1980s, which sought to criticize police brutality, incarceration of juveniles, and felony disenfranchisement. There's also, lastly, the World Conference on Racism in South Africa, which occurred in 2001 while Nelson Mandela was president. And you'll see how the United States has really been, unfortunately, not living up to its potential in addressing the problems of racism. They stepped away from the council in 2001 on the conference. There's Spike Lee, a critical director who made a documentary film about the disaster of Hurricane Katrina, while also making many black films, such as the film about Malcolm X. And to end this section, to end this anthology, is the election of President Obama. I'll just read what I wrote here briefly, but I make a bigger conclusion about him at the end of the anthology, at the end of part two of Contemporary Thought, 1975 to the present. I'll just read what I wrote here. Um, President Obama, an impeccable constitutional expert, orator, community organizer, and social reformer, passed the first universal healthcare program in American history. He led the climate accords, was a major proponent of alternative clean energy sources, won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work against nuclear non-proliferation and for his empathetic diplomacy towards much of the Muslim world. During the 2008 American recession, he revived many of the New Deal legislations, such as the Dodd-Frank Act to limit excessive risk-taking and protect the average consumer, and revived the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, $831 billion, which immediately created needed jobs for Americans. He managed to lower unemployment below 8%. Moreover, he was the first president to visit a jail, lower drug sentence times, visited to the prison that held Nelson Mandela in South Africa, and was a proponent of both political and economic equality. In the last section, I elaborate more, considering his importance as being the most important leader of the modern era after Nelson Mandela. So I thank you for listening to this podcast, and I'll be concluding with the last three parts, the two parts on contemporary thought to the present, and lastly, we'll be summarizing just the history of these five pivotal periods from abolitionism all the way to the contemporary era, and why, although there was many different strains of Black political thought and approaches to the Black liberation struggle, there has been a united front today to try to unite many of these ideas. And even though there's disagreement, there still is a struggle for Black people to create, in many ways, a contract with the United States government to live up to their political aspirations for both equality and economic opportunity. Whereas, as we know, it's as many people know, Black median income in this country is very low. Black people are still very much a marginalized community, and the Black bourgeoisie needs really to step up to their responsibility in helping the poor in this country. And that's my opinion. Some people may disagree with it, but this will be analyzed further in my summary. So I thank you for listening, and I hope you join me with my last three podcasts, which will be released February 28th. Part two will be released March 1st, and the summary will be released somewhere around March 3rd to March 5th. Okay, thank you. Bye.